Hello, my name is Daniela Rubin. I'm faculty in California State University, Fullerton. I will be presenting on bone mineral density in adults with Prader-Willi syndrome and how is that related to gait parameters. This was a joint project with my colleague, Derek Pamukov, and we got to do this project because of funding from the Cal State University System Chancellor's Office. Adults with Prader-Willi syndrome have low bone mineral density. Several studies have shown differences in bone mineral density between those with Prader-Willi and those who have obesity, with people with Prader-Willi syndrome showing low bone mineral density for the total body as well as the spine. Even some studies have shown a high rate of osteopenia and osteoporosis in those with Prader-Willi syndrome. The reasons for low bone mineral density in adults with Prader-Willi syndrome are varied. Initially, poor bone mineral deposition during adolescence, lack of growth hormone or sex hormones, as well as muscle hypotonia were identified as possible factors. Additionally, high rate or bone turnover with little deposition and more breakdown due to low concentration of sex hormones was also another reason that indicated that it helped explain bone mineral density, poor bone mineral density in adults with Prader-Willi syndrome. One more recent study showed that when adults with Prader-Willi syndrome go on growth hormone replacement therapy, this therapy is not efficacious to improve bone mineral density unless there is also replacement for sex hormones. Animal studies have also shown that there could be a critical region that it's missing that is causing that decreased osteoblastic activity that may be responsible for poor bone mineral deposition in those with Prader-Willi syndrome. Physical activity is one of the ways in which we can improve bone mineral density, not only in children with Prader-Willi syndrome, but also adults with Prader-Willi syndrome. The potential osteogenic impact of the activity depends on the magnitude of the applied load, the rate at which that load is applied, and also how long the load lasts, as well as how novel is it. In children, activities that have ground reaction forces that are higher than 3.5 their body weight per leg tend to have the greatest osteogenic potential, while in older adults, walking at 5 or 6 kilometers per hour, which is about 1.4 meters per second, elicit ground reaction forces that are sufficient for stimulating bone deposition. A few interventions of physical activity have shown improvement in bone parameters in Prader-Willi syndrome. We did a study looking at changes in youth with Prader-Willi syndrome and demonstrated increased bone mineral content for the lumbar spine, but an intervention done in adults showed no improvement in bone mineral density. From all the activities that people with Prader-Willi syndrome usually do for treatment and for management, walking is the most common practice activity. Therefore, in this study, we compare bone parameters in young adults with Prader-Willi syndrome to those without Prader-Willi syndrome to see if the findings we have in this population are similar to earlier studies, and we examine potential associations between bone parameters and mechanical loading during gait. These were the participants in our study. We had 10 adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, 10 adults of normal weight, and 10 adults with obesity. The main differences between the groups included that for those with Prader-Willi syndrome, they demonstrated lower body mass than those with obesity, but comparable to those of normal weight. They showed similar height as the group of normal weight, as the group with obesity, but they showed higher body fat percent than those with normal weight. but comparable with those with obesity. And comparable lean mass between those that had normal weight, but lower than those with obesity. Of these participants with Prader-Willi syndrome, 70% of them were on growth hormone replacement therapy. The measurements that we obtained for the bone were done using DEXA scans at both hips, the lumbar spine, and for the full body. We obtained aerial bone mineral density and bone mineral content. And the equipment that was used was the Lunar Prodigy from GE Healthcare. And the same technician did the bone measurements in all participants. For gait parameters, we collected 3D walking biomechanics using a motion capture system with 2 force plates. And the video on the bottom shows the image that is captured through this system, and it's showing also the force plates. The image on the top shows where the markers were located in the limbs for sampling the gait parameters as well as the force plates parameters using accelerometers. Participants walked at a self-selected speed over a 10-meter runway while striking consecutive force plates using their self-selected footwear. And if they had foot orthotics, they wore those as well. Speed was monitored using timing gates placed 2 meters apart surrounding the force plates. And participants completed a familiarization trials and then 5 trials that were completed with full contact with the force plates, and that in which the participants did not alter their stride rate and were within the 5% of the self-selected speed. The mechanical loading parameters obtained included vertical ground reaction forces. And for the vertical ground reaction forces, multiple parameters were investigated. So we obtained vertical ground reaction force, which is the peak ground reaction force collected during the 50% of the stand phase. Vertical load refers to the rate of loading on the slope of the rise of that vertical ground reaction force when the heel makes contact. Vertical impulse refers to the area under the curve for this vertical ground reaction force. Anterior-posterior ground reaction forces were collected for posterior force and for negative impulse. Posterior force was that peak braking force that is of negative magnitude, and negative impulse was the area under the curve depicted right here. These two forces represent the braking force, and this negative impulse force is the one that helps regulate our walking speed. What are the results of this study? So we found that in terms for bone parameters, those with Prader-Willi presented comparable bone mineral density and bone mineral content for all 3 sites, as well as the normal weight group. But they showed lower bone mineral density for the spine, the hips, and the total body compared to those with obesity. They also showed lower total bone mineral content for the body as well as for the hips. With regards to associations with biomechanical parameters, the associations that we found had to do with positive associations with gait speed for bone mineral density for the spine, the hip, and the total body, as well as bone mineral content for the spine. And presented, you're going to see either R-square values for linear associations or R values for linear associations, as well as Spearman-Rowe values for those that were done using non-parametric statistics. In terms of associations with vertical ground reaction forces, total body mineral density was found positively associated similarly to parameters of bone mineral content for all three sites: the spine, the hip, and the total body. Associations with vertical load included bone mineral density for total body as well as for the hip, and as well as bone mineral content for total body as well as for the hip. With regards with vertical impulse, associations were found for total body bone mineral content as well as hip bone mineral content. All these associations for vertical ground reaction forces, as well as vertical load and vertical impulse, disappear when controlling for differences in body mass. In terms of associations with posterior force, when normalized by body mass and without normalization, what we obtained were negative associations with this braking force with total body bone mineral density and hip bone mineral density and a spine bone mineral density, and additionally hip bone mineral content. Also, negative associations were found with and without controlling for body mass for negative impulse. Higher negative impulse was associated with higher bone mineral density, but these greater negative forces indicated more bone mineral density, as well as bone mineral content. Young adults with Prader-Willi syndrome showed in this study lower bone mineral density at all sites compared to obese adults, but comparable bone mineral density and bone mineral content as adults of normal weight. The adults with Prader-Willi syndrome in this study had comparable body mass, lean mass, and height as those of normal weight, and this might explain the similarities between these two groups. We've shown in children before that when you consider lean mass and height, there are no differences in bone mineral density between children with and without Prader-Willi if those have been under growth hormone replacement therapy. Additionally, Viardot et al. In adults demonstrated that in adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, lean mass is a better determinant of bone mineral density compared to fat mass. A faster walking speed was associated with greater bone mineral density and bone mineral content with stronger associations for the spine and the total body. Ground reaction forces, vertical load, and impulse during walking were related to bone mineral density as well as bone mineral content, but these associations depended on body mass. Adults with Prader-Willi syndrome self-select to walk at a slower speed than those without Prader-Willi syndrome, and they take shorter, wider steps, and they spend longer time in double limb support. Therefore, that reduces the load that is placed in a single limb and might explain why at these speeds, these ground reaction forces were not associated with bone mineral density or bone mineral content. In contrast, larger negative braking forces indicated by posterior force as well as the negative impulse were both associated with increased bone mineral density and bone mineral content independently of body mass. And these associations can be explained by the fact that when one needs to exert more force when you have to brake against the floor when you walk faster than slower. So in this case, these braking forces still show an association with bone parameters just during walking at a normal speed. Our results suggest that walking at faster speeds may contribute to bone mineral density and bone mineral content in young adults with Prader-Willi syndrome, and perhaps that's because of greater braking forces that occur during faster walking. With regards to application, our findings In individuals who are exhibiting a slow walk, it might be important to do strengthening as well as balance exercises in addition to walking to increase the possibility for a faster walk with less time in double stands to hopefully influence bone parameters. I want to thank you for your attention and to our study participants for their time.